Ah, yes. Wonderful, beautiful. Margarita. Oh, you're so good. Oh, hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Corey, better known as the Seaman. I want to welcome you to another edition of the Seaman's Cinema Sit Down. I'm sorry you caught me in pre-Margarita Monday warm-ups, so to speak. As you can see, I got my margarita, and as I mentioned, it is Margarita Monday, and while we are at, I don't even know what, it's this day of quarantine. I can do this with my beard. This is where we're at, with the quarantine stuff. This is how long it's been, man. I can do crazy things like this with my beard. Last week, the Seaman started a conversation with his good buddy Chris about HBO's Watchmen Season 1, which, of course, as far as we know, will be the only season. We talked mostly about the characters and a little bit about their stories last week. And that's pretty much right where we left off. We had just kind of talked about the main cast, which was quite large. And now it is time to dive in to some of the Seaman and Chris's favorite episodes, moments, and just storyline plots that we didn't really get to talk about up until now. So make sure you grab your margarita and join the old Seaman on a Margarita Monday Meetup with one half of Knock Music, my good friend Chris. We're talking about Watchmen Season 1. Take it away, past Chris and Seaman! Now it's time, and we've touched on some of this, but to really break into some of these storylines and things, and some of the individual episodes. I mentioned that The Extraordinary Being, which is episode 6, for me, especially as a comic book fan and a fan of the Watchmen, was my favorite episode by far. In the show, Lou Gossett Jr., Will Reeves, has these pills that he mentions to Angela at one point. He's like, I need my pills for my memory. And she's not putting together that it could be this drug called nostalgia. And then she tries to figure it out. She gives it to Looking Glass because his ex has a lab that she could figure out what it is without it going through the police, which leads to her getting caught because the cactus is bugged. And when Lori comes out to try to arrest her, the only thing she can think to do is just down all of it because she knows they're her grandfather's memories now. And that's not what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to take other people's memories in general, and more than one could put you into a coma, which happens to Angela. And Angela now starts to see, she starts to become Will, and you get this entire backstory to Lou Gossett Jr.'s character, all shot in black and white, except for his mother. Anytime that you see her playing the piano, which I liked. Anytime you kind of get those, that Schindler List aspect of one individual color. I love when you see stuff like that. But you watch this entire origin story of Will Reeves's character that sometimes becomes Angela because she's living it. So there's a point when he gets, strung up on a tree with a noose by some white cops who don't like that he's digging into their business. And that ends up kind of being the central focus around everything of the show when you start to understand what Cyclops is, who essentially are the 7th Cavalry, these white supremacist folk. But you kind of see she becomes him in that moment. Or my favorite shot that whole episode is he's sitting at a mirror putting makeup on, and his wife comes from a different direction and holds up another mirror, and the shot is from the backside, so his head never changes. And when they hold that mirror up, it's Angela's reflection. I was like, that that's good cinematography type stuff, or editing things where it's oh, that's such a cool element. And the thing that I loved the most about that episode is that episode is the secret origin of Hooded Justice, which, if you've read the original comics, he's the very, very first vigilante, with the Minutemen. And from what we know, he's white. The only thing that we can see are his eye holes, and around his eyes is white skin. So to learn that this black man, Will Reeves, is Hooded Justice, and it becomes it kind of spawns out, he kind of gets in there, or gets into white folks' business, and these cops string him up, with a noose, and they're you got to keep your nose out of white folk business, or next time we won't cut you down. And the only reason they cut him down is because he's a cop. Would be my only take on it. But he spawns out of that understanding, I can't get into white folks' business, and he's walking home, and he hears a couple screaming while 5 guys are basically assaulting them. and they covered him with a bag, so he puts that bag back over his head so no one would know it's him, or that it's a black guy coming in to intervene here. And then all of a sudden you like see the image, like the noose is around his neck and the ropes are around his wrist, and you're like, now so much, like so many things about Hooded Justice, which I'm sure weren't at play back then, or maybe they were, like it just added a layer that didn't exist in the comic book to like, oh, that's why that's going on. That's really, really interesting. That's really, really clever. And then the aspect of his wife going, you can't let people know that you're black. You have to white face this portion so that they think you're a white man. Genius stuff. Like I just sat there. I was slack-jawed the whole episode. I was just like, like the episode is shot wonderfully. The black and white stuff works. And then it's the secret origin story of a character that I've known for years, but you didn't know anything about him because he never ever takes his mask off. And I also like that story, like the American hero story, is constantly going on in the background, much like the comic book that's being displayed in the original Watchmen comic pops up, the Black Freighter or something like that. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But like there's a comic book throughout the entire comic that like you see a panel here or a panel there, but you never see the whole book. Same thing in the show. There's a television show that's telling you the origin of Hooded Justice, which is wrong. That like you get blips throughout the whole thing. Like I just all that stuff like all comes together in that episode. I just sat there. I was like, all right, Lindelof, I'm in. Well, you can have. Yeah. I don't have to pay to watch this, but you can have my money anyway. Because shit, dude, like so good. So for me, that was my favorite episode. How about you?
Favorite episode? It was tough because, like I said, like I think watching the show, I was almost underwhelmed because of what my expectations from the movie led me to want something else. But again, I think the more you and I talk, that episode has to be up there, you know, just because of what it shows. And but then again, you know, we talk about the historical side of it, and as someone who's big into history, I find the way they use Hooded Justice very unique, because even though Watchmen always used history, especially with the Vietnam War and whatnot, and having Nixon kind of reign longer than he ever would have in reality, Hooded Justice comes in a very specific moment in history of race wars, of extreme violence, and then his direct creation is from that continued violence, that continued non-acceptance of other races in this country. And it's amazing to watch that they can build that episode and show so much at once and just give you this whole character. And it's, you know, I think after they probably know more about Hooded Justice than any other character in the whole universe, possibly. I mean, you know, you don't get a lot of backstory for all these characters. You get enough to know who they are.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And like you said, the interesting play with using something like the Tulsa Massacre was like 1921 or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that if you're not a history buff like myself, the first thing I said to when I was watching the first episode for like the second time when I was rewatching outside of Comic-Con, I was like, I wonder if that's a real piece of history or not, because it could totally play as a fictional piece of history that works very, very well for the story that they're telling. And that, like you mentioned, is kind of an interesting and risky play when you're playing with real history that people might not know was real history and something that's kind of been forgotten. Whereas like in the original comic, you're talking about Vietnam. Up until maybe the most recent generation of humans that is coming out, everybody knows what Vietnam is, right? Because we all either had family members or, you know, our family members knew people who, it was something that affected everybody, to where generations after Vietnam, we all know what Vietnam is. It's a risky play, but for me, it works in, like you said, giving that motivation and understanding why Hooded Justice and Will Reeves does everything that they do throughout the entire series.
I think the motivation's right. I think using something that really was so terrible and really knowing the historical outcome in the failed court cases and the lack of responsibility that people are held to of it, it's tough to use that as a defining moment of a superhero.
Sure. And it's the first thing that you see.
Yeah. So, like, I understand that you need to use a moment that's extreme like that. I think they could have created something that might play better just from I'm I don't think they mean to devalue that moment, but it didn't create a superhero. There's a continued issue with racism in this country, and these issues persist. And to put it into the Watchmen perspective, it allows for, I think, people to downplay it and ignore the severity of it. And, even when you look at the Seventh Cavalry, the Cyclops storylines, which all relate to the ongoing issues, I don't know if it does enough for people who don't really separate truth from fiction. And and there's some good articles online that really talk about that moment specifically. I think the show gets universal praise, rightfully so.
Mm-hmm.
But utilizing that moment, there's a lot of great articles that talk about the gray areas and really go into how truly awful that moment in history was.
Sure. And I think it's one of those other things where, like I said, to you earlier, Lindelof creates a show that works perfectly within the context of telling a Watchmen story.
Yeah.
But much like the Watchmen, had the political aspects and sides to it, Lindelof was going to obviously play with stuff like race and what has been going on in this country, in the last, for however long, but specifically it's kind of peaked a little bit more than we're used to. I mean, seeing KKK members, whether they're in white polos or in hooded uniforms, walking through the streets in America in this day and age, that's you just sit there and you go, how is that even possible? And if you to talk about the political stuff they talked about in the original comic, that's what they used Vietnam for. I think it makes sense to use a real historical thing that maybe people don't know about, and it's like, hey, let's shine a light so that maybe now people can know about it or look into it, and also show you that dichotomy of 1921, this actually happened. 2019, which is when the show takes place, we're not too, even in this fictional reality, in 2020 right now, pre-coronavirus, which I said to you, the coronavirus is kind of like the one-eyed squid in the original movie. It's something that's kind of gotten the whole world on the same page.
And all the cops are wearing masks, so they were ahead of the curve.
It's true.
Too soon?
No, it's not too soon. But it's one of those things where you're able to go, wow, we're not so far off. We thought we've advanced so far as a country and as a rate, as humans, and in reality, we're not too far away from things that happened in 1921 if the right buttons are pushed. But they didn't. They didn't let you know that was a real thing, or they didn't give you the historical context.
And I don't think there's enough commentary on it. When you look at the Vietnam scenes in the movie and in the book, the comedian especially talks at length about what they're doing, what they're not doing, how that relates to the bigger picture and all. The opening Tulsa massacre is an incident that just leads to where Willis does what he does. So I think without giving more context, you loosely see the museum and, they bring it up, but you're not.
It's not solidified in a way where it's factual.
Yeah, it's not a big enough. Yeah, I mean, you could have easily had a bunch of KKK members walk in a house and kill someone's aunt, or whatever isolated semi-fictional event. But to take something that really was a huge deal is different than just using random violence, which both would have led to the same outcome.
Sure. But at the same time, we're having this conversation now, right?
I know. I just think I think the show would have benefited from a little further context, whether it's in the museum scenes or whether it's the conversations with Willis and his wife as he's becoming Hooded Justice, or laying in bed with, what's his name? The other Minuteman. You know what I'm talking about. So,
I know who you're talking about.
So he does have a secret gay relationship with one of the other founding Minutemen, and within that whole context, he's still trying to fight this race war and trying to, bring equality. And the Minutemen, who are all white besides him, they're not ready to fight that war yet in the 50s, 60s. So I think without having that deeper conversation of what he lived through, thank you, Captain Metropolis. Without having that one extra conversation of what he saw, and you understand his plight, but I don't think the universe that he lives in understands why he's on that plight. It could have been showcased.
And I think there's an opportunity for it too. Just listening to what you were saying just then, it popped in the when Will and his wife are having a conversation where she they're in bed and she's like, tell me about the first time you ever saw me. And that first scene after like his parents and the ride that he's in, they die and he's like left all alone. There's a baby wrapped in an American flag. That baby ends up being his wife later on. That spot could have been an area where you had more conversation about that because he's a little kid, but obviously he remembers everything about that moment in time. And she was a baby. There'd be no way for her to remember that. You could have had a little bit more of a conversation there that maybe shines some more light or kind of gives you more context into the fact that like this was a real event for anybody who didn't know.
Yeah, and again, I think even talking to Metropolis more, because there are very key scenes where Metropolis downplays his attempts to fight the inherent racism in the systems. That's a big part of where the Minutemen exist. But there's a lot of intimate moments with Will and Captain Metropolis where they could have had those conversations in a more real dialogue, and they could have further brought up the still large gap between where Metropolis felt the world was and where Will saw the world. So I think the show needed more context, use something that was so terrible, so extreme, whereas again, using Vietnam, the story's more well known. The comedian has some, as grim as it is, some great commentary on where the world is. Even the scene in the movie where he's fighting off protesters in the middle of the street. I mean, he really gets to the heart of all these movements and all these historical moments. You don't really have that moment in the show, I don't think.
That's fair. I can't say that's an unfair thing to go after. Speaking of histories, and that's the other thing too that's so interesting with the show is it does such a good job of telling a linear story, but also highlighting individual characters each episode where you're getting backstory. And one of the other backstory episodes that I thoroughly enjoyed spins right out of, episode 6, which is the 7th episode, An Almost Religious Awe, where you get the backstory of Angela. Like as she's on the drug that's clearing out her grandfather's memories, we start to finally be able to dive into what her history was, because she grew up in Vietnam. And like seeing all that stuff was another thing that was like, as you get it, it's progressing the story forward, but it's also giving you all this context into what happened to this little girl in Vietnam. Like they're having, I guess it's her birthday, but it's also going on the same day. There seems to be some sort of like there's just I guess there's Dr. Manhattan stuff everywhere, but it's her birthday.
I think they're celebrating I guess from the context of America, it's the freeing of Vietnam from the dictatorship and communism of the Vietnam War.
Okay, yeah.
So now it becomes a U.S. state. So they're kind of celebrating the independence of it, but again, from a very Americanized perspective.
Yeah.
So obviously for people like Angela, who's a transplant, her father was in the army and all, Vietnam being an American state's a victory. But for some Vietnamese people who were there before it and have their own culture and history, we see time and time again, they don't see that the same way.
Yeah,
so that's
we're like
walking
invaders.
into. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's coming out of a video store where this is where, and another thing, like a secret origin to how she becomes Sister Night. She she was fascinated with this movie title called Sister Night because it was a black heroine on the cover, and in Vietnam, there are no people that look like, Angela. So that, like, her grandma at one point goes, "Why this movie?" And she's like, "Because she looks like me." And I think they actually use Regina King on the cover. Unless it's a real movie. The one time I saw it, I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. What is that?" That kind of looks like Regina King. But the concept that, like, from your skin color standpoint, outside of her family, there's nobody in Vietnam that looks like her. So that movie calls to her, even though her parents won't let her watch it. And she's coming out of that store, and as she does, you see her walk past this guy who's got like a puppet of Dr. Manhattan shooting the lasers out of his hands, ending the Vietnam War. And then you see this guy on a bike with a bag riding right up to an area where her parents are standing. and he kind of makes like the, like intruders or invader kind of comment, and then a boom, bomb explodes, which kills her parents. And it's one of those contextual things where we've seen stuff like that, especially in the superhero genre.
Yeah.
We've seen parents or guardians get killed in front of the children plenty of times, where it sparks this thing for them to become who they are.
The Waynes have died more than any other parents on the face of the superhero world, I think.
Or Ben Parker, like whatever it is.
Like,
it's a trope that's used over and over again, because to be crazy enough to put a mask on, and let's just utilize Batman, dress up like a giant bat, you have to have some sort of hardcore traumatic moment when you were a little kid. Like that can't
Absolutely.
it has to be something that your brain can't wrap around, right? Like if I'm in my 20s, or even if I'm a late teenager and something like that happens, you have enough experience in the world where, yes, that trauma is going to have a massive impact on you, but you'll eventually be able to wrap your head around it. You're a kid, you can't wrap your head around stuff like that.
Sidebar. Sure. We think, is there a mainstream masked superhero that's human who doesn't have a family loss? Because you have Iron Man does, Batman does, Spider-Man does.
Yeah, I mean Captain
America,
I don't think had any like thing.
Yeah, but he didn't have. But he
was
an
picked
orphan.
on.
Wasn't he kind of an orphan?
I don't know.
Because in the first Captain America, doesn't Bucky go to his parents' funeral, his mom's funeral?
Oh yeah, you might be right. So I don't. Yeah, I mean, look, like I said, if you're going to, if you want me to buy that an adult will dress up like a bat to go punch bad guys in the face, I need a hardcore trauma to happen to a child, where the only way they can get their head around or move forward is to dress up in some kind of a costume and go stop the people who made those types of things happen. And the interesting thing with Angela's character that I love in the episode, it's dark, but obviously after it happens, she's put into an orphanage. And while she's at the orphanage, like a couple cops come in to kind of ask her questions, because they catch the guy who was puppeteering. The puppeteer guy gives the bomb guy the bomb right before it happens. So she's like, yeah, no, that was the guy. And then they essentially and she talks like an adult too, like through that whole situation, where the cops kind of like respect her to a degree, and they pull the guy out, and the one cop takes this guy around the corner of an alley, and it kind of disappears. And the woman cop that's standing there kind of is like, why don't you go back inside? And Angela goes, can I listen? And she wanted to be there to hear that guy get shot in the head, because he's one of the main two reasons that her parents are dead. And right after that, the Vietnamese police officer gives her badge, or like a copy of her badge or something like that. And she's like, when you grow up, you come find me, because I think you might be an asset to like the police force. And she does. She becomes a police officer in Vietnam, and then, eventually moves to Tulsa. But that whole, finding that whole backstory, that's anytime you have a main character who's your hero, the backstory is so integral to understanding the motivations and where they come from. And as dark as that one gets, it just highlights everything that Angela is as an adult so well.
Yeah. And thinking about it, like, again, I think Watchmen's one of the fewer backstories are kind of gray sometimes. Like, I think the original, the movie especially, like, yes, there's backstory, but you don't need all of them to understand them.
Sure, no, Adrian.
So I think Watchmen's one of those exceptions, and I think the fact that the show utilizes it the way they do was,
and the show gives
smart.
It gives you two origin stories too, right? Like, we didn't really have any origin stories, too early on, outside of like, you understand why Silk Spectre becomes Silk Spectre because her mom was Silk Spectre and things of that nature. But, and same thing, I mean, like, you do get that bit of a backstory to Lori in the comic, where it's like, okay, the comedian raped her mom, and that's why she was, born. Kind of plays into a lot of the things that she ends up motivating. But here, it's more traditional, like, comic book origin story.
Because
I think work well to highlight the story that Lindelof is telling.
Because I think the main backstory, another one would probably be Manhattan. That's the one you get the most into.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, you have to give Manhattan some
Well,
kind of a backstory. Can't just be like, there's this blue god walking around on the earth, and he can blow himself up like Giant Man and shrink himself down like Ant-Man and do whatever he wants.
But it wasn't just that. I mean, they give you Osman's life.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. For sure.
Even though they expand upon it in the show, you only need the show's continued backstory to
flush out
get
what
to
they're
the
doing.
Adrian.
Yeah.
Yeah. The story of Manhattan is told so well in the the original concept that it really is the only one you need. The other people are just people who have that much other desire and craziness to be what they are.
Well, and that plays into my second favorite episode. A god walks into a bar because Angela's last name is Abar. It's play on words. I love shit like that. But in that, you have this whole conversation, which we talked about before, where, Manhattan basically tells her, like, we're going to end up together. We'll live together for 10 years, and then something tragic's going to happen. And you have that whole conversation going. But at the same time, like, it starts with him coming down, sitting down, starts to talk to her, and then basically is like, will you go to dinner with me tomorrow? And Angela's like, no, I don't even know who you are. Like, you could say you're Dr. Manhattan, but you're coming into a bar on a day where everybody is painted blue right now, and you're wearing this mask. Like, I don't have to believe you. And but the thing I love in that episode is it's not just it's because she's so dead set against it. He has to tell her his story so that she kind of understands everything, and that's where you do get that little bit of a piece of John Osterman as a kid, where his dad is a watchmaker and they're getting ready to come to America from Germany, and they go to England and kind of stop. There's like this castle type place where people stop before going over, and there's these two people, a man and a woman, who kind of own it's their place, and that they're the ones that kind of shepherd these people in before sending them out. And Osterman sneaks into a closet and sees them having sex, so that they are starting to have sex. And then they have this whole conversation about, like, well, we had a son and we lost our son, and what we were doing was beautiful because we were creating another child. And they give him the Bible and all of these things, and you're kind of getting all of this stuff about his backstory as a kid. But none of that means anything to who he is as Dr. Manhattan. It means everything to the world, the Eden that he's creating on that in Jupiter, where he recreates that land and that castle, and all of that plays into why that exists and why it is what it is, which, like you said, plays into Adrian's story. And that it takes us 8 episodes to finally get that context. But that's the one where you kind of rip the Band-Aid off and go, oh, this is what's been going on, where Adrian is the whole time. And they're not clones. They're actually an Adam and an Eve. And the look of Adam and Eve are the man and woman that Osterman saw as a child. That, like, even though he caught them or saw them doing something he shouldn't have seen, they were nice to him. And that makes them Adam and Eve. And basically he just says, like, the way he creates the water creates these two, like, life.
Yeah.
Two, like, they look like newborn infants. And then obviously Veidt figures out a way to expedite the process of them growing into adults, which is just silly. But like, the amount of, like, and then it just kind of plays into what, like, it kind of rips off, like, oh man, like, all this effed up stuff that, like, Veidt does to these people, what they actually are means something totally different. But at the same time, also really, really entertaining and funny to watch him just off these, they're essentially like clones, to do whatever he needs to. And the fact that the only way he was going to get off the moon, when he finally, there's a point where, like, you're starting to understand that this place isn't on Earth. And the thing that kind of tips it, and we talked about this offline, was when he starts launching the dead bodies into space. And
that is one of the most fun, crazy scenes.
Well, I love the way they shoot it too, right? Like, you get the catapult launches, and then they go to what he's seeing. So you're seeing it out of, like, this giant, telescope that he's using, and you see them, like, approaching a cloud, and then they disappear before they reach to the cloud, and you're like, there's some sort of mirage going on here. And that they're in space, and he launches himself out that way. Once he figures out that the suit he has enough, it will protect him. And when he gets there, all the bodies that he has launched are all laying all over the place, and he breaks off their limbs and body parts to spell out, "Save me, daughter," which plays into the Lady True aspect. And when Lady True approached him, initially, the first time she comes out to his Antarctica laboratory and is like, hey, I'm your kid. My mom stole your semen and injected it into her. And, because he goes, I've never had sex with anybody. And she's like, well, mom did some shady shit and that got me here. And like, I graduated from MIT and then I bought MIT and I need some money to like do what I want to do. And he's just like, no, get out of here. But he tells right to her face, he's like, I will never acknowledge you or call you daughter. And the only way he's going to get off that moon is if Lady True can save him. So he spells out in the body, save me, daughter. And I'm laughing my ass off going, oh, that's just.
That whole sequence is probably one of the best sequences of the whole show.
It's so good.
To act that way when you're, not that he's not alone because he has the clones, but, he really has to kind of act against himself a lot because they don't interact the way humans interact. So It's interesting seeing him interact with people who don't necessarily interact back.
Yeah.
But yet they're all acting together. It's tough to explain it because until you see what he does.
Oh, yeah.
And then, he gets court-martialed, which is crazy because he kind of sets the rules. But he's getting court-martialed by this whole group of clones who are looking down on him. I mean, it is wild.
That whole sequence is so good because at one point when one of the clones comes back and they're frozen, so he attaches a rope to them so they can pull them back in, and you see that the guy didn't survive. He freezes to death, so he goes to find a thicker skin and he goes and he shoots a buffalo. And it's the first time we've ever seen the game warden, who's just another Mr. Phillips, he's the original Adam that Manhattan killed.
Yeah.
And you understand that it wasn't something Manhattan put into place. Veidt made him the game warden just to give him something to do. So when he's finally trying to like get out and the game warden's like, you can't leave. You think it could be a Manhattan thing, but ultimately we understand like when you get to the horseshoe and the cake bit and he like escapes out of the prison after that whole courtroom scene, that it's all been Adrian the whole time. Like he put all these things into motion to create a game for himself so that he wouldn't lose his mind up there once he realized that it wasn't really paradise, but it was more of a prison.
Yeah.
But the whole bit, like that whole courtroom scene, like when he tries to leave and they like he gets warned once and then he tries again and they bring him into court and the game warden's sitting there and like all the other cloned versions of them are the jury. And he's like, I'm not even going to have you guys figure out what because you're his servants, you live for him. You're not his peers. We got to bring in his actual peers. And this whole slew of pigs come running into the courtroom. And it's like you could look at it as like a pig or a swine, like all these different things you could use the symbolism of a pig for what Adrian is. And then when they ask him, so do you have any closing remarks or, say to yourself? And he just lets one rip, like he just farts. And he's like, the defense rests. And you're like, this is all just a game. And it's easily the most entertaining episode. And then I love the fact that the finale episode where we see him finally get out, and launch himself off of there. That episode is called See How They Fly. The comedy stuff that's around the Adrian character so interesting because that's something that like he's not a funny guy, but the most entertaining things I think from the show stem from that whole storyline.
Yeah, I think I think the comedy that comes from the original movie and all gets transferred to him because of his situation, because he just has, like you said, he has to stay sane.
Yeah.
And he's so smart that his staying sane has to be beyond entertaining and over the top because he is just that smart. It's something else to witness.
Oh man, like if us talking for as long as we've talked about Watchmen hasn't gotten you on, well, I mean, if you're watching this and you haven't watched Watchmen, shame on you. Why would you spoil it? But like
we spoiled everything. So
that stretch of the show should be the selling point to anybody who's unsure of watching this. Like, just watch Jeremy Irons just craft this unbelievably ridiculous game so that Adrian's character doesn't go crazy. Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. But playing into the last two episodes, which are two of the strongest, last episode's solid. 7 and 8, I think, are probably the two strongest episodes.
I think to look at it, I think there's a lot of backstory, as we mentioned. So I think when you're watching the show, episode 1 through 7, you're moving forward, but you have to go backwards as you move forward. And there's a lot of that. And it's why I said at the start that I think the show feels slow at times.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely a show that picks up as you watch.
Like Suzanne loved the movie. She watched the first episode and had no interest in the rest of the thing.
That's fair.
And I get it though. Like it feels similar, but you're missing some of that pulls you along. But as you watch it, you understand you need all that.
Oh yeah.
So as you're saying, episode 8 and 9.
Yeah, that's pretty much just all forward pushing.
Yeah, the strength is that you're now caught up. All the characters come together finally. You're starting to see where the universe makes sense.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're just getting pieces of Tulsa life there of. It's connected, but you're not seeing them interact all together.
Yeah,
they're very individualized episodes in a smart way, but they are.
I guess because even 8 is all backstory too. Like that's that whole God walks into a bar bit. So it's really the only episodes that don't really flash back at all or too much are the first episode after you see the opening sequence and the last episode, which is an interesting way to bookend a show that is. I said this to you offline too. It's pushing itself linearly forward the whole time, but is utilizing backstory to push the story forward. Which is, if you told that to me like in a pitch room or like we're trying to like get me to wrap around before the show exists, I'm like, well, that's an interesting device. We're going to do that the whole series.
Yeah,
but in context, when you're watching, it ends up working really, really well.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can really think of many other shows that pull it off that way.
And it plays itself the best in the finale when I don't know if we talked about this here yet. I know we definitely talked about it before, but you get to the end and you come to find out that Angela's husband is Dr. Manhattan. He's basically become a human being so that he can live this life with her. It's the only way that she'll allow the relationship to go is if he can completely hide himself, and he knows this because Adrian had created something to wipe his memory so he wouldn't know who he was. And it essentially acts like amnesia, and they're able to build this whole story of Cal got into a car accident and whatever. But as that's coming out, you get to the point where the tragedy is about to happen. Like the thing that he warned her all the way at the very beginning of their relationship is finally starting to happen. And she just knocks the shit out of Cal's forehead with a hammer and rips this thing out of his head that allows him to become Manhattan. And when he becomes Manhattan, he suddenly is having to it's almost like waking up out of a coma. So he's kind of confused. Something that you've ever seen Manhattan be, which Yaya crushes. Like to see him play Cal, this loving father, loving husband, who does he's the quintessential husband. Like if you were going to model yourself after someone he nails the husband and dad stuff so well. And then to see him flip that to that just like at times almost soulless delivery that Manhattan has, genius. But as they're kind of like, as he's kind of starting to get things together, he's popping in and out. He's trying to make food. He's doing all these weird things. And then they have this conversation outside of the pool where she's like, essentially you're using the past to push the story forward by having a conversation with someone in the present and someone at the past at the same time, because Manhattan, it's all happening at the same time. So you watch him have this conversation with her grandfather where she's like, if you're in this place where my grandfather is, ask him this. And then he asks, how did you know that, the chief was a KKK member? And Lou Gossett Jr.'s will is like, I didn't know that. And all of a sudden, like as the conversation, the two of them are having a conversation through Manhattan, and it just hits Angela like, I started all. Don't tell me that I started. Like if I didn't ask that question, none of this would have ever happened.
Yeah,
and it's a fascinating thing to watch because the show doesn't exist if that moment doesn't happen. Yet it is one of those things where you're playing with the present and the past simultaneously, and that pushes the whole finale part of the story forward. Like you're just sitting there, and you're like, damn man, like it's so good. And then
I mean that's probably the most Manhattan moment of maybe any of the Watchmen. I mean that really just they figured that out in a very brilliant way.
Yeah, well, it's it's one of those things where it's like I said to you, I couldn't imagine trying to write for Manhattan because there's no way to relate to the way his brain and physiology work.
But there's also a freedom to that too. Like you're allowed, having written a book, just to draw back to, it's available now.
Hey, but pick that up.
And even as a songwriter, like I think you have fun when you get to be something that you can't be, and that's the whole point of this.
Yeah.
The fact that Manhattan exists in this way, and that there's Alan Moore's Manhattan, and now there's Lindelof's Manhattan. Like, he doesn't have rules because he is above them, because he is essentially a god. And when you write that way, like, I guess in the superhero world, Superman was kind of a god. He is that other worldly figure, but this goes way beyond that, because
Superman can't create life.
No, yeah, even though he can push time and change things that way, he is not Manhattan.
No.
So I think it's probably incredibly hard, but also there's no rules.
Yeah.
You're allowed to have conversations 40 years apart. And, I think the hardest part of writing is that you have to give characters boundaries and understand how they relate to humanity.
Sure.
The fact that Manhattan doesn't have to relate to humanity, the fact that he can make absolutely no sense, is almost why he makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But I still, a smarter person than he's got to be writing that shit, because I wouldn't have gotten you there. And you mentioned like the way that like he is a legitimate god where Superman isn't, right? Like Superman can influence and do all these things, and you can't kill him unless you got kryptonite and all this stuff. Manhattan literally can just wave his hand and create life, and that brings us to the quintessential being of what the end of the show is, and the reason for me that the season and ultimately series, because Lindelof isn't going to make a second season, at least he won't do it. HBO maybe down the line will, but the last I read, there is no season coming.
Right now they said they won't without him.
I want Lindelof to make a Watchmen show that is just adapting the comic onto a TV form, because you could do the Squid story and it would make sense in a long form, where it made sense when Snyder didn't do it. But I'm digressing. The reason for me that the show is perfect is because of the end note, and it ties into the conversation that Manhattan has with Angela at the bar, where he says, I just have to wave my hand and make life. And she's like, well, do it. And he kind of does like what looks like a magic trick, and he reveals an egg. And like the conversation they're having, she ends up asking him like, so like he says something, and she's like, well, would you like, if you had kids or something like that, like would they then have your powers? And he's like, I would never give my powers to someone involuntarily, like without their knowledge, because that would be unfair. She's like, but like what, like but like is that so? She like, so I was like, so that's possible? He's like, well, theoretically, I could create some sort of organic life that has my powers in it. And she's like, so like an egg, like if you put your powers into the egg and someone ate the egg, they would get your powers. And he's like, theoretically, yes. And again, it's like the clever writing that when you're so caught up in the moment of what's happening, right? Like you're finally getting to that tragic moment where the 7th Cavalry is outside of Angela's house because they're coming to take Dr. Manhattan. They know that Kal is Dr. Manhattan. They're going to get him. And she, wants to go stop that. Which again, that whole stretch, the writing is so good, because like she asks him, what was the moment that I fell in love with you? And when she goes to try to save him, even though there's no way she can, because history is history, you can't change it, he looks at her and goes, this is the moment. And after he kind of wipes out all the 7th Cavalry, she's like, what? He's like, the moment I fell in love with you. You ran into danger to save me, even though you couldn't. She's like, but we won. And he goes, no, we didn't. I'm sorry. And there's one more cavalry guy that zaps him and takes him to, where the whole finale ends up. Just to cover it so that we have covered it, because I love it. Adrian turning the squid babies into ice like hail rocks that end up stopping Lady True from being able to take Dr. Manhattan's power at the end of the show.
Destroy her machine, destroy everything that's going on. Yeah.
Genius. Yeah. But as genius as all that is, and all of it's wrapping up, and I'm just sitting there going, this is doing everything I want. There's a small moment right after Manhattan comes back where like he's kind of, like I said, he was popping around and flashing in different places, and Angela ends up being outside and that pool conversation happens. Then he just disappears randomly, and she goes back into the house, and I think he says, "I'm hungry." And he's in there, and he's just like whipping. She's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like,
trying to make breakfast.
I'm making waffles. And he goes to her, watch for the egg. And the carton of eggs comes out. She's like, none of this bullshit. Like, you're about to die. There's madness about to happen outside. Like, stop this, focus, and just shatters all of them. And after everything's over and Manhattan ends up getting destroyed, like exactly like he said, Veidt ultimately he is destroyed and killed essentially before Veidt takes down True's machine and everything with these frozen squids. And, you get another wonderful moment where he becomes Cal again and looks at Angela, who's sitting there, and he just goes, like, I'm okay. And she's like, what are you seeing right now? He's like, every single moment we've ever had. And they do like this quick flashback, and it's beautiful, and the writing's so good. And then she comes home, and she's cleaning up. And as she's cleaning up, the carton of eggs is there, and she relives the moment where he goes, watch for the egg. And she opens the carton, and there's one egg unbroken. And all of a sudden I go, in the moment, had no clue what that line meant other than like he's bringing eggs to make waffles. Why is he making waffles? Because he needed the waffles to make one egg that had his powers. Like he does exactly what he said he could get. And she ingests the egg. And the whole thing is in the conversation. It's like, so if you put it in the egg and I ate the egg, you're saying I could walk on water. And he's like, theoretically, yes. And she eats the egg. She's out by the pool, and her foot's about to go. And I swear to you, I'm watching this, Chris, and I go, if I see her foot hit that water, the show's not as good as it should be. That needs to end before it happens and leave it up for interpretation. And literally, she's like millimeters away from the water, and it cuts to black. And I was like, yes, there it is. Show's perfect. Love this show. Boom. That was that was the exclamation, the cherry on the top for me. I was just like, oh, you did everything, Lindelof. You're a freaking genius.
Come on. Too many HBO shows that are great end with fade into black without answers. Damn Sopranos.
Sure.
Kidding.
I'll give you that. But
it was the right ending. I did catch on to the egg thing when he was, because it's right before the cavalry comes that he's in the kitchen frantic. Yep. I did catch on. I didn't maybe fully catch on, but I knew he had the eggs out for a reason. I figured that out.
Yeah, but I was just like, genius. He's hungry. I understand. He's been in a coma for 10 years. I'd be hungry too.
But he doesn't eat. He's Manhattan.
Well, that's fair. I'm not thinking about that. I'm just like, ooh, waffles. And I get caught up with. That's my problem. As good as I am with the amount of shit that I watch, I fall for the setup every time if it's executed well. And I was like so interested with like, oh, that conversation with Gossett Jr. And all these things that are happening. I'm not even thinking about the freaking egg from episode 8. And then when she goes back into the kitchen, I'm like, oh, she better not freaking walk on water. I don't want to know. Like, I want that to
I think only because it happened so relatively close in the timeline of the 8 episodes.
That's fair.
It was in my head.
I should have seen it.
Because as I said, and as we've talked about a lot of the backstories and a lot of the characters' interactions get revealed very slowly.
Yes.
And very well done. So even though I was trying to figure it out, you just almost couldn't. They gave you just enough to need more, which was the genius of the show, because you want to know what her grandfather's doing. You want to know what Adrian's doing up wherever the hell he is. You want to know why there's a giant clock being built. You want to know why Blake is still calling Manhattan, but she works for the FBI. I mean, you want to know.
We didn't even talk about that. That whole bit is so good. That whole joke that she tells him is we won't spoil that. There's a joke if you haven't seen it and somehow you've gotten all the way here that she tells him in one of those booths that's so good. And it's slowly played out through the whole episode that reveals her backstory.
But I mean, I think again, if they had shown her meeting Manhattan earlier, maybe I would have forgotten the egg thing. It was the only thing that happened in a close enough timeline that I was just like, okay. Because I mean, I didn't watch the show week to week. I watched them all like in 1 week after it was all out.
I know. I fall for it every time.
But I mean, it's well written where you should. The egg happens early on in 8, and then it's such a whirlwind. You're watching him about, the cavalry's coming. She's freaking out. He's coming out of, Manhattan is coming, Manhattan's coming out of a coma when he's not he's Manhattan, but in a very different way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's enough distraction.
It's
great.
The other thing that I thought was genius, because it was bugging me the whole time I was watching the 8th episode, is you never see Manhattan's face once that whole episode when he's sitting at the table with her.
Yeah.
Because he has to be Manhattan. But the cool thing is when he becomes Manhattan after being Cal, he keeps Cal's face. So Yaya gets to play Manhattan, which was awesome. Like I said, acting-wise, he crushes it. But if you show Manhattan's actual face, like you couldn't have had Cal, like it's obviously Yaya speaking, and like he kind of tweaks his voice a little bit. But you couldn't have him sitting there because then the reveal of you took Cal's face doesn't play. And that one of those things where whole episode is like, why just show me his face? I know that Yaya is like it's him. Like I never thought like, oh, and that was like another one of those cool little touches.
That was genius for so much. To have that happen in Vietnam on the Freedom Day, 20 years after her parents are killed, she's drinking to forget, she's forgetting that moment where she lost her parents in a bar. And Manhattan walks in dressed as Manhattan in a costume. I mean, there's a lot of great layers there.
Oh, there's so many. Like, if somehow you've listened to us talk for 2 hours and you haven't seen this show and you let us spoil all of it, go back and watch it anyway, because there are little tiny things that we didn't touch on that like they're just little moments through the whole show that are wonderful. And if you have watched the show and you've listened to us, go back and rewatch the show. I want to go back and rewatch the show after this comes.
And if you haven't read the PDpedia, read that. Yeah,
that I'm definitely doing because that seems like it's going to fill in a lot of things.
There's so many details, and it's why I understand. It's why I think I was more forgiving to the show after I read it, because I understood where Lori becomes who she does. I understood why you don't have Dan in the show. I understood why Adrian's where he is. I understood why she has the giant Manhattan dildo in episode 7 or whatever.
Thank you. How did I forget that? Right before, so
there's a diagram in the Pedopedia about that.
Is there really? Oh my gosh, that's hysterical. That whole setup is like she's carrying the silver briefcase with her like all over the place early on in the show. And she gets back to the motel, leaves Petey, at his room, goes into her room, opens it up, and there's a Silk Spectre Manhattan porn DVD with this massive blue dildo. And then she doesn't even use it. She calls Petey over to have sex with him, which I thought was hysterical. And I was like, good for you, Petey. Like, you love her so, like, and it's probably one of those, like, she's like, I'll give him a win because he's a fan, even if he's a history buff. He's a fan. But the concept of the Pedopedia file stuff is so cool because he's a very small character, but I liked what he represented. So to have that be something that's outside of the show that you can go and look into,
it's cool. You see why he's kind of the outsider in the FBI. Because again, like I said earlier, he annoys the people who don't care about it. It is ancient history at this point. As much as us fans love the original characters, in this timeline, it's almost forgotten. I mean, this is a thing that the world tried to eradicate from the history books per se.
Yeah.
So, to have this kid be so into it, but be in the FBI, to be alongside Laurie Blake, to have these memos that he writes to the whole agency, to watch him be mocked within these memos, but then to get the full backstory, it's really worth the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out tonight. All right, Chris, we've pretty much cracked into everything you could crack into in the show. Is there
one more thing?
Look at you. It's like you read my mind. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to touch on before we get out of here?
As a musician and a music fan, and as one of my favorite artists being cool. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, him and Atticus Ross, his partner, Nine Inch Nails, they did all the music for Watchmen. They did a great job. And the thing with Trent...
Is that for the soundtrack or the score? Because they obviously soundtrack. Use... Okay, because... And it made me think of it. I love the choices of music. Like actual music, like songs with lyrics that are in the show. Like the music they use in the show, the soundtrack works so well. And I remember when the movie came out, the soundtrack was something people had issue with. Lindelof and team, I thought the soundtrack and like variations of different songs that they use was so good. But the soundtrack for the show that's not in the show is the Trent Reznor stuff.
So Trent did all the scoring and all that. Him and Atticus Ross do a ton of great stuff. They did Gone Girl. They did Social Network. They did Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I mean, they've really upped their game beyond just the Nine Inch Nails thing. And the cool thing about what he did was he put the album out on 3 separate vinyls or 3 separate CDs on Apple Music.
Or downloads. I'm like going like, people don't know what vinyls are, Chris. CDs. People don't know what CDs are. For your MP3s. Well,
people should know what vinyls are.
Yeah, they should. Vinyls are making a bigger comeback than CDs.
So what I want to say was why I love this and why, I think, why I love the Pedia. I think HBO recognized they had to make this a bigger thing than just 9 episodes. So what Trent Reznor did is he has 3 separate discs. The first one was under the title of Sons of a Pale Horse, which I think it was episode 6 with Mirror. They talk about the day the squid fell and playing at Madison Square Garden the night it fell.
That is
Sons of a Pale Horse.
That's on the marquee.
So in the first volume of this came out on vinyl, it's the album Sons of a Pale Horse. On the Nine Inch Nails website, they do a whole mock. They have a whole bunch of reviews of why this band is forgettable, but they only matter because they were playing the Garden the night the squid fell.
So
the first vinyl is based on that, even though the music is just instrumental stuff for the show. The second volume is called American Hero Story. You have Hooded Justice on the front,
and that's the name of the TV show that they kind of reference every once in a while through the show.
Now, I didn't buy the first 2 because of money and timing of buying limited stuff, and because I don't need to buy all instrumental stuff that he's done outside of Nine Inch Nails. Sure. I did buy the 3rd volume. The reason I bought the 3rd volume is that Nine Inch Nails, every single release they do is based on something called a halo. So every Nine Inch Nails release has a halo. I think he has 34 out right now. I have every single one on vinyl CD because I am crazy. So this is really cool because it's by the Nine.
I'm going to interject. You like when he says he's crazy, you don't understand. I have a DVD issue. Chris makes my DVD issue look childish. If you were to ever walk into his bedroom when we were kids, the amount of CDs this kid owns is insane. And the amount of times we teased you or faked, like we were gonna just knock them all over because they're all in a specific order and coded. And I can understand that because I do the same thing with my DVDs. But you, sir, are on a whole nother level. Like I guess CDs are a little bit cheaper, but
a little different.
Music,
but vinyl,
vinyl's
a whole different ball game within that. So
that's very true.
Did the vinyl? So it's by the Nine Inch Nails. It's labeled Halo 10, which would go back to the year 2001. So you're erasing 18 years of Nine Inch Nails history to put this thing out, in theory. So he puts himself within the timeline of the Watchmen. On the front of the vinyl, he has a warning sticker. This album contains sounds and frequencies recorded at M-Site 11.3.85, the crater. So that's where the castle that Osterman moves to his fake world for Vite exists. So this album is based on something recorded from that time. He has a whole booklet that talks about the time period, how the tapes were lost and how they were recovered. The inner vinyl jacket is everything's blue. There's all these different signs. It's like the coordinates for where his separate world is.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
And then on his on the Nine Inch Nails website in his store, you can buy T-shirts based on the Nine Inch Nails, not Nine Inch Nails. And I texted you, Corey, the other day, some blue dust from the crater that goes for $195. That is not available to purchase, but there was a loophole. If you add it to your wish list, some people got little notes in the mail saying, we can't ship this because of the radioactiveness of it, but thank you for your interest. I mean,
that's so
Trent Reznor.
He did this on his own? Or you think?
I'm sure
he had to collaborate with HBO.
I'm sure there's a whole team involved.
Yeah.
But I mean, the fact that even the sound, there's a lot of cool soundtracks involved. I have never seen something to this level of detail.
That's
and
wild.
it's just genius. So I mean, as much as I may have had certain little issues with the show and all, the commitment to making this work on a bigger scale, that HBO and the people involved, the actors, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, it's almost unprecedented, I think. I mean, this is pretty crazy.
That is wild. And like me asking you just now, like, did he do this on his own? Obviously, he probably collaborated with HBO, but let's go full circle, tie this baby all up, because I love to tie shit up. Well, it's the chicken or the egg, which Manhattan references in the show when he actually makes a full egg. Like, I'd be fascinated to ask Reznor if he came up with the idea while he was scoring, if it was something that him and HBO talked about, like when they were doing all that stuff, working together already. I hope that it was like he did this, like they brought him on to do the scoring, they do the scoring, and then he went to them like, hey, I got this idea. I'm gonna do this on my own, but it'll tie in. Like,
I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. You know, he's done this whole vinyl revival of his old back catalog, and even on his website for his main releases, when they do the reissues, he says, we put so much time and effort. There are details here that you will never even hear or see, but they matter to us. I mean, he's a guy who's just passionate.
That's dope.
Here's a guy, just for a fun Trent Reznor story. I think it was back in 2011 or so, after his album, oh my god, something. I can't think of a second.
The music guy, Chris.
I know you're not. His Year Zero album. So he had an album called Year Zero. It's about a futuristic society based on a complete takeover by a central power. There was supposed to be an HBO show, never happened. But the fun part of the story is he is walking in Virgin Megastore in Australia, I believe, with a bunch of label people. And he looks at all the new CDs, and he sees his and Avril Lavigne's. His is like $14 or $14.99 in whatever Australian currency. Avril's is $9.99. He goes to his label people. Why does my CD cost more than Avril's? They go, your fan base is way more loyal. We can sell more. We can, they're going to buy it anyway. Avril's, we have to just get rid of it. He fired his label that day.
Love that. I love that.
His next 2 releases were independent releases.
Oh, do you see that?
He cares.
That's the type of shit that just shows you like you have an artist or any that like care about that. Like the reason he has that fan base that'll spend whatever amount of money the label wants to put on there is because of shit like that. That's awesome.
Yeah. And even now when he's so big, I mean, he's Trent Reznor. He can do anything he wants. And he still has he doesn't have to do this. He gets soundtracks off. He's doing a Pixar soundtrack. He's doing a ton of big stuff.
Crazy. But
he cares enough to like do this triple vinyl release with all these details to make the fans that much more intrigued. I mean, it's what make again, I think the rollout of the show and how they marketed and what they did outside of just the main show, it's way bigger, and they respect what it is, and they really went out of their way to do it right.
That's I'm usually the person who closes, but I don't think you can close on anything better than that. Chris, man, we talked about this months ago when you finished watching it. We're like, I need someone to talk to. I hope this conversation was everything you hoped it would be, because it's certainly been a real good time.
I'm glad it's worth harassing you for the past couple months to get you here.
Well, you know what? And if it didn't take all of those months to get here, we would not be doing this in a recorded session where we can go back and listen to this, one day when we're old and go, oh, remember that time we talked about Watchmen for 2 hours? Yes, I do. It's right here. We can listen to it. Thank you so much, man, for coming on. Being our second Margarita Monday Meetup guest. I really appreciate it. And most likely because this one's 2 hours, you'll be the second and third guest. Because we'll split this bad boy up. But dude, this was so much fun. Thank you for coming on. I could not have had a better person to have this conversation, talk about this show with than you. So thank you so much. Is there anything, I know we did it at the top, but we're on a second episode. So plug your stuff one more time for the fans out there to have them get your stuff.
I wrote a book called Who Will Survive. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all digital book reader websites. Who Will Survive by Chris Vuoncino. I'm sure Corey can plug a link into his
I will put
notes.
it down in the description down below.
And if you like electronic music, any kinds of EDM, we do pretty much everything. My group is called Knock, NOHC. All my websites and socials are at Knock Music, NOHC Music. We have a ton of great singles coming out with a whole bunch of talented worldwide artists on a bunch of big labels. So please check it out. Corey, thank you so much. I love talking to you.
Oh, obvious.
And this was awesome. Had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for coming on. I know he just told you to, but I'm gonna tell you too. Go check out Chris's stuff. Him and Sue's music is great. The book is fantastic. And just as we lose 2 hours, you did not the phone over.
I know.
Dude, thank you so much for coming on. We definitely have to do this again. We'll have to find something else that is worthwhile of talking. And
I'm sure we can kill another 2 hours pretty easily, you and I.
I'm sure, without a doubt, man. That happens with 30 years of friendship. Thank you again for coming on. Thank you to everybody who listened, man. I always say it's crazy when people listen to me talk, or me and people I know talk for 2 hours. Obviously it'll be integrated in 2, but even for an hour, thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking around. I hope you guys enjoyed this, took some stuff away. Maybe we gave you some info or thoughts that you hadn't had after watching Watchmen. If somehow you're crazy and you listened to all of this without watching Watchmen, thank you. Appreciate the support. But now go watch the show, man, because the show is tremendous, and we definitely didn't cover everything, although we cracked into just about everything. So yeah, man, make sure you guys, thank you for coming around. As always, I want to know what you're thinking. So if you've watched Watchmen and you've listened to all of this, let me know what you're thinking, man. I want to know what you liked about the show. What was your favorite episode? Who were your favorite characters? Who was your standouts? All the stuff me and Chris just talked about. Highlight the things that you loved or didn't like. If somehow you didn't like, Watchmen, which is understandable. I know Chris had some reservations, and then this conversation seems to have pulled him onto my side of the world, which I love doing. But let me know everything you're thinking down below in the comments section. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Know that you're not just giving me a thumbs up, you're giving Chris a thumbs up, man, who's giving me 2 thumbs up, which I love, and I'll give you 2 thumbs up, man. But do that if you enjoy this video. If you like listening to me talk, or you like these Margarita Mondays, man, you like to sit down, crack open a margarita or beverage of your choice. Obviously, Chris was cracking a beer. And you enjoy hanging around, listening to these types of things. Right now we're on YouTube. I think if I stockpile enough, maybe we'll release just the audio versions. But if you like this stuff, you want to be here for these things, I urge you to come support the Cinema Sit Down by hitting that subscribe button over there. You really like what we're doing, you want to know when we drop stuff like Margarita Monday Meetups, hit that little bell that follows so you get alerts every time I drop a new video. For the C-Man's Cinema Sit Down, this guy over here is Christopher Vuoncino. I am the C-Man. I am signing off. Chris, do it with me. Peace.
Well, as I live and breathe, you're still here? Check out a video like this one or this one, and hit the subscribe button so you can get alerts and check out everything the C-Man's got at the Cinema Sit Down.